Hi, I'm Dave Rupert, and today we're talking about HTML with Superpowers. Let's kick it off. I'm Dave Rupert. I work at Paravel in Austin, Texas. We're a small web design and development agency. I co-host Shop Talk podcast with Chris Coyer from CSS Tricks. It's like 10 years in the running. You might like it. And I'm from the W3C. Well, truth be told, I'm not from like the actual W3C. I'm from like just the web components group, but not even like the official web components group that like makes the web components. I'm just from the community group, which is kind of like, yay, we like web components. And I'm not even like a significant like chair or anything of that group. I'm just a member, and I have a beard. So let's dive right in. What are web components? Well, we can, check the website. Web components are a set of web platform APIs that allow you to create new custom reusable encapsulated HTML tags to use in your web pages and web apps. The key word here is encapsulated, but that's kind of just a big, business speaky block of text to say Legos, right? Legos. We should all be pretty used to this. Design systems have been a big topic for a lot of years, and then we take those designs, those components, and then we implement them in some JavaScript framework typically, and that produces, we stitch that back together and make our websites or web apps. But this isn't like new. We've been doing this for a long time. Dojo did it first. You have jQuery, you have YUI and jQuery UI and EXT.js, and Angular came around on the scene, and then Bootstrap, of course, can't forget Bootstrap. React, you got Vue that does components, and Svelte is another one that does components, and then you have, of course, web components. Web components, shockingly, are from like a 2011 talk, and then they were supposed to come out in browsers, and then it took a very long time. But in this kind of world of web-based component systems, you might say, like, what makes web components unique? We have JavaScript systems. Why would we need another thing? That's a fair kind of question. But the reason web components are unique is they're a set of web standards. Web components are actually 4 different HTML specifications that exist in various states. So you have HTML template, which is the idea that you can create a template fragment. It's literally a template tag, but then JavaScript can consume that template in JavaScript, and you don't have to like stitch together a bunch of DOM elements. And then custom elements is literally like custom element. You define the element yourself. You can kind of make my map or Dave's dog, whatever you want to call your element. It just has to have a hyphen in it. But that custom element can be kind of a short code for whatever you want it to do. Shadow DOM is the next thing. That's a really user unfriendly term, I'd say. So we could say encapsulation, which is not much better. But the way I think of it is like a web component's almost like an egg, and there's a shell around the egg, and inside is the shadow DOM. That's inside that egg is the web component stuff, the stuff the web component does, the events, the styles, and everything. And in the shell prevents it from bleeding out all over the place, and then also prevents stuff from getting inside the web component. That has its pluses and minuses, as we'll kind of see down the road. The next thing is HTML imports. Those were killed by Mozilla, so now we have ES modules. I'm not bitter. Yes, I am. We'll talk, God forbid you want to import HTML using HTML, but whatever. We'll talk about that over beers at the bar, the virtual bar sometime. All right, great. Web components. But like, is anyone actually using them? Yeah, that's a fair question, but lots of companies are using them. Google, Microsoft, IBM, YouTube, GitHub, Red Hat, Salesforce, ING, it's a bank, and Adobe, design nerds. Lots of people are using them. And Red Hat and Salesforce, they have whole design systems implemented in web components. So they're really turning into like a compelling technology that you can actually kind of build some sophisticated systems with. According to Google, 12% of pages loaded in Chrome use web components. And that's, Google looks at a lot of pages. This could be all YouTube pages, but 12% of every page load in Chrome, 12% of all the page loads use a web component. So they are in use. But, if they're so great, why am I not using them? That's like a perfectly valid question. I have opinions here, but I think they were designed too low level at first. They were designed for framework authors, JavaScript framework authors, and they didn't use them because their frameworks worked and they had customers, and they weren't like, oh, we should just drop this and switch over to this new thing. It wasn't that compelling of an offer, especially when it wasn't feature complete. Web components also, kind of had a bit of a marketing problem from kind of heavy-handed advocacy, sort of like, hey, your thing's slow and bad, use our thing, it's good and the best. And then framework authors, there's sort of some JS shaming that had some unintended consequences. Notably, AMP is like a web component framework, or its first edition was. So take that as a grain of salt. Hard to invest in something unknown. I think for a lot of people, they don't want to invest in something unless they've seen it proven out. Part of React's success was that it was Facebook behind it, and therefore it must be good. People don't want to invest in something unless they read on Hacker News it was a good thing that people had success with. It's not truly supported, until very recently. The roadmap is long. Basic implementations didn't arrive in Safari until 2016, Firefox in 2018, and Edge, Microsoft Edge, didn't get it until they switched to Chromium in 2020. So if you were using web components before this, you were kind of a beta tester because it wasn't out and everything yet. It was slow to roll out. So I think now, 2020 on, we kind of maybe get to look at using web components as a platform feature because they're everywhere. And that kind of leads me into the next bit, like, web components are slower than like your standard JavaScript framework because they are web standards, right? So that slowness is what makes them frustrating, and they don't get new features as quickly. But that slowness is what makes them a stable foundation to build on. You can kind of depend that the feature you built yesterday will work in 5-10 years, but you don't always get that kind of feeling from other JavaScript frameworks. Building, speaking of building, Jeremy Keith has a great talk on building, and he kind of borrows this idea from Stuart Brand about shearing layers and pacing layers, and then he applies it over to HTML and stuff, and like to the web, TCP/IP. It moves slower than HTTP. And then that moves slower than URLs, and that moves slower than HTML, and that moves slower than JavaScript, which moves slower than HTML moves slower than CSS, and CSS moves slower than JavaScript, which gives all Jeremy Bearimy all over the place. This is the reality. This is what it feels like. But this is also a great framing for web components, how to talk about web components, because they are these things. A web component is an encapsulation. It's a group of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, a payload to build websites. So let's talk about each kind of crust of this sandwich here. Using components with HTML. Step one. Well, I'm going to be pretty honest with you. I'm a little disenchanted with the modern web development story right now. It's tough, it feels at times like there's all this stuff you have to do, and you just want to write HTML and CSS. You just want to make a website, but then you have all this JavaScript and all these build tools and all this packing and unpacking and tree shaking and code splitting and all this stuff just to make a website. So here's my first assertion about web components, okay? My first assertion is web components bring us closer to that feeling of writing HTML again. My first example is, you've probably seen these sort of before and after photojournalism stories. I really love these. I'm not because I like looking at disasters, but I like seeing improvement. And I also just love the comparison. I'll stare at every pixel in the before and after and see what changed. It's a really evocative way to storytell for me. But I'd never want to code one, like ever. You have absolute positioning of images, and then you got pointer events, and then you got to make it work on mobile. It just sounds like a lot of work. I don't want to spend like weeks and months supporting this and building this and doing this. But lo and behold, I found this from Google. It's called 2UP. It's just a little one-off web component. So here we go. It's the 2UP element, custom element. You know it's a custom element because it has a hyphen. And that custom element takes two images, a before and an after, and each one's wrapped in a div. And then that markup's pretty okay. And then you have like a link to the script tag. And the outcome is this. It produces the same effect. I'm actually using the same exact images from The Guardian. I borrowed them. But this is, I'm using these just as an example. You can create the same effect with like 5 lines of HTML. Now, that seems pretty good. But let's keep looking here. Another example would be like an alert on your website. Most websites have an alert. Not every website has a 2UP. Most websites have an alert of some kind. So it has like an image to an icon. It has the alert message, and then it has like a close button, or maybe there's a call to action button of some kind. I don't know. That's your call. It can do kind of a myriad of things. But, I'm going to be honest with you. I don't trust all my coworkers to kind of do the right thing. They're not going to put the right alt attribute, or the right, they're going to not put the file path right. It's going to break, and then they'll add too many classes, or they'll put a strong tag instead of just an alert message, or they'll, do the button, but then they won't, wire things up correctly. Wouldn't it be great? Wouldn't it be better if I could have a cleaner kind of way to write this component, right? Rather than just copy and pasting HTML. And that's sort of where web components come in. I can create a custom alert, and I can pass it an icon. And so I know that, and it's just a text. It's like something you picked from a select menu. That way I know it's always going to go to the right place. And then the alert message is just any kind of message paragraph that you pass through, and then we link to the element itself, like our own custom element. And we know it's a custom element because it's got a hyphen, and then it produces something like this. Pretty basic, So what's going on behind the scenes is that JavaScript is creating something inside the element, the custom element, called shadow DOM, which is a bit confusing, but it's basically a encapsulated piece of HTML where all the styles in JavaScript and the HTML itself don't shoot out over the page, and they just live inside the component. And that slot element in the middle there, that's a way to bring content from that you put inside the element. That's the way to kind of slide that content inside the shadow DOM. Very interesting. It's confusing. We'll talk about it a little bit later, but that's kind of just what's happening behind the scenes. We took a paragraph, and then we progressively enhanced it into some kind of alert. Well, that kind of leads me into my second assertion, which is web components are great for progressive enhancement. Take, for instance, this one. Okay. Podcasts, right? Everyone has one. I have 3. One common thing on a podcast site is the audio player. And I'm very opinionated about the audio player. It needs to have a 30-second rewind because you're like, oh, that was good. What was that? And then it needs to have 1x and 2x and 1.5x. It needs to have a speed changer because that's a core feature of podcasting. If it doesn't have that speed changer, you don't have a podcast. You just have a long MP3 that no one's going to listen to. So you need to have that feature. I'm very opinionated. Another nice to have is deep linking. Maybe I could pass a timestamp in the URL and it'll shoot me straight to where it is in the audio file, just like a YouTube video or something like that. Well, wouldn't it be cool if we could have that? The native audio player, however, it's pretty boring. Pretty basic, has very rounded corners in Chrome. And so this doesn't work for everyone, I probably, I've used it before, but it doesn't work for everyone. And actually it looks different in every browser. So you kind of want something. Anyway, wouldn't it be cool if we could create a podcast player element and wrap our audio file? So it's going to live as an audio file. And then when the script loads, it's going to upgrade into something like this. And this is completely unstyled, but kind of what's happening is where the shadow root is taking over. The shadow DOM is being generated and the slots passing the audio element into it. And then all of our buttons show up, all the SVGs for all the icons, and the input range as the sort of slider is right there. So all the stuff is sort of generated into the audio, like around the audio component. It sort of takes over. If you want to see an example of this, we have it on the Shop Talk Show website. It's the same audio player, but we added some custom styling to it. It's pretty cool, and it works. And like we did an accessibility review with Derek Featherstone, and he gave us a pointer. He was like, if you use an input range instead of just like a div, we can actually, or even a progress, but an input range is cool because like it has the touch events for the little thing. So you can actually save code just by using native HTML, it turns out. So we ended up with something cool and something more accessible because we were using a web component, and we didn't have to go back through all of our 500 episodes and edit some HTML. We just, upgraded this one component. Which leads me to my next assertion, that web components will let us make simpler, more accessible, and more maintainable websites. Wait, I hear you saying. Are you saying web components would allow us to create and share accessible pre-built components without the need for specific JavaScript libraries and overly complicated build processes? Oh, I guess I am. That's the vision. And in reality, that's the current reality. We can do this today. This is a library called Generic Components by Pascal Schilp. Sorry, I hope I said that right. Pascal. And it's basically a bunch of components that are coded to the Y-ARIA authoring practices specification. Sure. But they are all coded to that spec. And so it looks a little bit like this. If you want to use generic tabs, you add some buttons for the tabs, and then you have some panels, and that slot attribute is saying like, put it in the panel section, put it in the panel section, put it in the slot section. You can have as many slots as you want. Actually, I just showed you one, but this is sort of the structure, and then it upgrades and adds all the correct ARIA roles around everything, and it adds the correct ARIA stuff so that this thing works as expected in a screen reader with all the key bindings and up and down arrows and left and right arrows, and it just works like really, really well. We, a group of people working on kind of some like tabs research stuff, got together though, and we ran this by somebody who uses a screen reader, and they gave us some feedback. They were like, this is okay, but like if I am not upgraded, if I don't get the upgraded experience, say JavaScript fails, or I just have it turned off. I have a friend who's very security conscious, and they just turn off JavaScript. I don't know why they do that, but they do. You still want them to have an experience, and having just two buttons floating around isn't the most semantic document in the world. So we came up with a solution where, what if you pass like an H2 in a div or a section or something, and you just kind of like pass these things, and then they get auto upgraded into tabs. And so we PR'd this. It works. You can use it today. But it's just this idea that these sections kind of form themselves from good HTML. You progressively enhance kind of a title, panel into a tab set. I was feeling pretty proud of myself, pretty clever, but then I realized, this is basically what Hixie proposed for HTML in like 2004. So, just whatever. I guess I've been I don't want to think about spending the last, like, whatever, 20 years of my life not using tabs. So anyway, I'm going to think about the future. Okay. My fourth decision, web components are a gateway to a new dimension, a new reality, a virtual reality. This is a web component called Model Viewer. It's basically a way to put a 3D model in the browser, and you can also use it in AR on your mobile phone. Pretty cool, pretty revolutionary. I mean, I think, if you're shopping for a car or furniture, this is starting to become the standard. I don't know how to do 3D on a website, but this component does, and I can just drop this in and use 3D. The way you use it, again, script tag to the model or the module, and then model viewer source, just like an image, path to the astronaut, like 3D file, a GLB or a GLTF. You give it an alt attribute. You can auto rotate things. You can give it a camera controls, a few other attributes that kind of help you control the look and feel. This is pretty cool. I don't need an astronaut. So I thought, what could I do with this? And, I kind of like Dungeons and Dragons. So I was like, I'm going to make a site about a lizard wizard. And I got a 3D asset off of Sketchfab and I pulled it down and put it in my local host, and I just started playing around, just trying to see like, maybe you could kind of make some compelling editorial content, or maybe if you were at a university, you could have a 3D map of the university, or maybe if you were at selling a car, you could have a 3D car or something out there. The possibilities are endless, and I feel like this is a really kind of interesting way to get a 3D model on a page with like one line of code. It didn't take much effort. But I hear what you're saying, Dave, can we go deeper into the matrix? Can we go more immersive? And the answer is yes, you can. Using A-Frame, this is one of my favorites. It's a 3D virtual scene builder, 3D AR and VR experiences. And it looks something like this. You have the link to the web component, and this is actually a group of web components. But you have a scene, and inside of a scene, you have a sphere, you have a box, you have a cylinder, you have a plane, not an airplane, but like a two-dimensional rectangle, and then you have a sky. And the output is something like this, a full 3D scene that we can walk around. I'm using the WASD keys to kind of walk around, and my mouse to kind of pivot things. But, if you had one of those, virtual reality headset thingy bobs, you could, with an attribute, start allowing people to explore the space that you created. Can you do cool stuff with this? Yeah, people are doing cool stuff with this. What did I do with it? Well, I did something different. I made a whale that, you can like talk to, and it'll dispense agile practice advice. So I don't know. It's not good, but hey, it's fun. And that's kind of the spirit I'm trying to get back to, is the fun internet. I hear you saying, hey, Dave, how do you find these cool web components? Well, me personally, I have like very poor work-life balance, and so I just like look for stuff on the internet all the time. But you can use this little website I made to collect those, called Awesome Standalones. Standalones is a term that no one uses, but it's my way of saying something you can use without a framework. You can just grab a script tag and plop it on the page, and you're off to the races. Most web components, you can actually do that. You can, but I'm kind of thinking of the like more interesting ones, something you wouldn't want code by hand, or it's maybe more complex than just a button from a design system. Anyway, go check it out if you're interested. So just a quick summary before I wrap this part up of what's good about web components. They're easy as HTML, great reusability, better experiences, progressively enhanced, no build tools. You didn't see a single build tool, and encapsulated. That keeps all the styles, the shadow DOM in there, and the styles don't bleed out and wreak havoc. But as you'll see here, as we move up to the CSS layer, the story gets a little more complex. styling with web components. Okay, truth be told, this is not very fun. And because it all depends on this concept of piercing the shadow DOM. And that is just the dorkiest phrase we have, but it is also the best phrase we have in web development. So we got to just accept the fact that it's called piercing the shadow DOM. So what pierces the shadow DOM? That's a good question. Because remember, we had the custom alert, right? And the existence of shadow DOM implies the existence of light DOM. All that HTML you write inside the custom element, that's called light DOM. And then that gets passed into the shadow DOM. And this is the shadow DOM. It has our image, our slot, and our button. But that little line around the shadow DOM, that is called the shadow boundary. So, and then from a styling perspective, it's confusing what goes through the shadow boundary because some stuff does and some stuff doesn't. And that's actually, it's interesting because it's like a loss of control feeling. If you're comfortable with the global cascading nature of CSS, you actually become very frustrated by this because you're used to just adding important to everything and boom, it looks like what you want it to look like. You have ultimate control, except when it comes to web components. So we'll do the thing where we'll take our web component that we made and we're just going to chuck stuff at it until we learn about it. So styling light DOM, this was sort of my first question. I wrote that P tag. Can I still style that P tag? Yes. I'm doing transform rotate because I'm a monster, but you can style light DOM. That's your light DOM. You can style it. Okay. That's good. You can't style it. Yeah. So that's your light DOM. You style it. So what about that button? We'll try to style the button. It didn't work, right? We don't have control over the button because that's in the shadow DOM. But maybe we can deep style it, right? We'll just dig into it. No, that didn't work. And this is what's frustrating. I think of most people who know CSS are like, why didn't that work? This doesn't make sense. This is broken. It's not. It feels broken, but it's not broken. It's just saying you can't style this thing. This is the limitation of web components. But if this wasn't difficult enough, some styles do bleed through. It doesn't make sense. Well, it kind of makes sense. They're called inheritable styles, which are, I had to look it up on W3 Schools, but it was basically these properties that can have the value of inherit, but they are the basically texty, color and font and transformy kind of values. They are stuff that you would sort of expect to pass to an iframe or something like that. These are styles that will pass down to a web component. I'm changing the font family, but that's not the relevant bit. The color red, I was coloring my icons with the current color. So my SVG icons are colored by the current color. And there we're able to turn that icon red. We still can't touch that button because it's like a replaced element, and styling buttons are a little weird, but we'll see what we can do there. But this is pretty cool because you know what else is an inheritable style? CSS variables. If the web component has CSS variable support inside of it, or if you have a design system and specific design tokens or something, you can put those inside your custom elements and your custom alert. You can pass that information into your web component. In some other, like 2UP, the one I showed earlier, that side-by-side before-after image viewer, they offer a styling API. And it's just a handful of variables, 6, 7, 8 variables, but it allows you to customize the look and feel of the component to a degree that hey, that's probably good enough for production or to match our brand or whatever need you have. It gives you just enough customization that you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you build it. These CSS variables, they're a really great way to add a styling API if you're the component author. So if you're authoring the component, you can add these styling APIs to give a little more flexibility and maybe lessen the support requests, I guess, to support this like color or this theme or something like that. But speaking of that, there's more ways, some more ways to offer styling hooks, and one of them is themes. In the custom alert I built, I added a theme for like warning, a little more dangerous level, and then even a danger level, that goes all red. I thought, this would be a good way to offer themes to the component. And I'm using an attribute. You could just use class equals warn or alert warn or something. I just like to use the word theme because it's very explicit. And again, it's sort of like, I can see it as like a drop down value or something like that in a UI. And the result looks like this. And, people hooked it up to the WYSIWYG and now they're spitting out whatever headings that, oh man. But I'm still kind of mad about that button, right? That button's kind of getting me. So we have one more tool in our tool belt, shadow parts. So again, we have our custom alert, the light DOM goes there. And then this time in the shadow DOM though, we see this name attribute, and name equals icon and name equals button. These are named parts that we can kind of hook into. And we use the CSS part pseudo element or pseudo selector. So custom element part button. And we can, if it's a named part, we can style that part. And voila, we have styled the button. Finally, we accomplished our mission. So crossing the shadow boundary can be frustrating because some things go and some things don't. It's actually kind of comforting to me to know like deep styling is kind of the one big no-no. But the idea there is just like, if that's my limitation, I can probably live in that world and then not be less confused by the inheritable styles and other things that do cascade into the shadow boundary. So hopefully that makes sense. That cleared up the kind of styling issues. We'll kind of keep going here into JavaScript land. This should be fun. Okay, so every web component has a lifecycle. A lifecycle is basically a set of events that are called in order, right? So the first thing it does is call the constructor, right? And that's just kind of program JavaScript classes. They call the constructor, and the super function means make this custom alert look like an element. And then there's other callbacks that happen throughout the life cycle. Connected callback is like when its component did mount or mounted in Vue, component did mount in React. It's basically like when this thing is connected to the page. Disconnected callback, when it got disconnected from the page, component will unmount, etc. Attribute change callback. This is sort of the like, you could say sort of reactive state sort of, but you have observed attributes, and like in those, if you observe those attributes, then they will fire the attribute change callback. It'll tell you the name, the name of the attribute that changed, and then the old value and the new value in case you want to do something with that. Custom elements, then you define the custom element with your name and you point it at the class. This is pretty boring to write. Small libraries exist to make writing web components nicer. Lit element is sort of like a React class flavor, but it uses, instead of JSX, it uses HTML template literals. Kind of cool. Hybrids is sort of like a functional svelte style twist flavor on web components. Pretty nice. An ionic stencil is sort of like a class based with decorators. I don't know, it looks a little bit like Angular to me, but what's cool about stencil is it kind of goes out to other frameworks. Like you can transpile this to Angular component or a React component, or and I know a couple people who are doing that with success. There's other flavors too. I think like there were 33 different flavors of web components when I checked. Maybe it was 17. Anyway, there's a lot of different flavors. One of them is Haunted. It's like it's React hooks flavored web components. So if you really want this weird feature, or you want one certain feature in your web components, it exists. It probably exists. So, and it's worth mentioning too, all these libraries are pretty small compared to like the 130 kilobytes or so of like React DOM and React. So these libraries tend to be pretty small and pretty lightweight to implement in your project. So here is a basic example in Lit, the framework I kind of gravitate to, or just library. It's kind of not even a whole framework. It's just a library. So we have our icon and theme, and we pass it a thing. Okay, so get into the JavaScript. We import lit element. That's kind of the base class. HTML is the HTML template literal string, and CSS is the CSS template literal string function. And so you basically, the first function we call is styles, and that returns a block of CSS. Host is the element itself, and we set up some variables, and we set up some layout and some padding, and then we kind of keep going down, and we add some themes. The danger theme is red and white. The warn theme is gold and black. And the nice thing about using these attributes is you don't have like class equals danger class warn, and then you hit some specificity issue. So that's another reason I like to use this. And then we're placing the SVG on the grid, and we're placing the button on the grid, and then we're doing slotted is another special piece inside the web component where you basically the slotted content, and I'm matching it to star. I can kind of mess with the slotted content, remove some margin, set a max width. So you have a little bit of control over the content you slot into your web component, how it behaves. Moving down, we get the properties. These are your props, icon and theme. They have types. And then we get to the constructor. We make it look like a HTML element. We give it all the behaviors. This set attribute role alert. I set some ARIA attributes because I don't trust my coworkers to do that correctly. I'm not even sure I'm doing this correctly, but you know, ARIA alert, role alert has like a role of assertive or ARIA live assertive by default. I thought maybe polite was more appropriate, so I put it to polite. I don't know. I'll want to test that with users. I'm just showing off this is for demonstration purposes only. Close is an internal method. That's what the underscore means. And I just set this hidden equals true. Easy enough. Render. This is sort of the meat and potatoes, but really it's just HTML. I have an SVG that's display none because that's an SVG sprite sheet. And then I put in an SVG, and then I slot the content, and then I have a button that has an event of click, and it closes the custom element. And then we define the custom element at the end. And this is what we end up with. And it closes, and it just works. You know, you could take it as far as you want to. You could add whatever sort of remembering the widget has been closed by the ID, like storing that in an IndexedDB or a local storage or something like that. This is a demo, but really you can kind of build up from there. So what's neat about web components, once you have them, right, you can then take these web components and give them to other frameworks. Other frameworks can use web components. So they don't just live on an island. They can go places. And even what's neat about these is like these frameworks, you can like technically write web components. You can write Vue and spit out a web component. It works kind of both ways. There's one notable holdout here, but for more information on that, you can go to Custom Elements Everywhere. It's a website that kind of documents the cross-compat issues of certain frameworks. And most frameworks work, some don't, some have some quirks, but it's just sort of like how well do they play with web components? How well does your framework play with web components? And it's that sort of thing that leads me to like why these companies are maybe preferring web components or investing in web components. Because they all, you know, probably have some kind of design system or component system. And then it has to go places. It has to go to the Vue app, the Angular app, the React app, the Svelte app. But it would be like totally cool if it just went to these four things. Like you could rewrite those components in those frameworks, I'm pretty sure. But oftentimes it goes to places that aren't JavaScript based. It goes to the old Java app. It goes to the old .NET app, the Rails app, the 11D site, the WordPress site, the Drupal site. It can kind of go to a bunch of different places. So I think this is a place where web components really shine. And why big companies are kind of using this is because they need their components to go to more than just one target framework. These web components are showing their strength because they're the native building block, right? They're the native Lego for building component systems on the web. They're designed to kind of go everywhere. And your mileage may vary. Maybe you have to kind of realign yourself to sort of the web component paradigm. But some companies are experiencing some decent success with doing this. So let's get into some FAQ stuff, right? IE 11, gotta know, does it work? Yes, it does. Google maintains a polyfill. They use the polyfill, presumably. Your mileage may vary. IE is becoming a less of a requirement for me, but I know it's been a blocker for some clients in the past. If it is a concern to you, remember like the progressive and enhancement part of web components, you don't have to do the polyfill at all. You can just style light DOM and call it a day. Think about that. There's a couple options here with web components. SEO, Googlebot will index your content. It actually flattens the shadow DOM and light DOM. I don't know if that happens on first pass or second pass, but your content will be indexed. Accessibility is a little tricky, particularly around labeling and focus management. I'll direct you to two posts, one on web.dev about more capable form controls. Is basically like, if you click a label, like it should like focus the input, but if that focus is moving into the shadow DOM, it gets confusing. And then there's another one about managing focus, kind of like, if you open a modal, but that modal is like a web component, like, where does stuff go? TLDR on accessibility is custom elements around form controls have some gotchas. And you just kind of need to know what you're doing, kind of approach it and test it and make sure you're getting what you need from the accessibility model. It's getting better with this thing called element internals, which allows you to like attach like invalid and make it more like a native form control. And then also form data is another thing where if you're posting data, data from a web component wouldn't go into the form submit. So you kind of build up this form data thing and send that off instead. Focus management is tricky, like always, just be careful. Inert is a new property that's coming out and it might be really time saving here. So we just need to kind of hope it rolls out in browsers. Again, web standards. What about my favorite things? State management, server-side rendering, props, attributes, hot module replacement. This is all stuff that's being discussed in the community group. So there should be hopefully news or movement on this. But, again, it's kind of web standards pace. It may not happen today or tomorrow. But if you're interested, those sort of things are being talked about in certain groups and GitHub issues. So just a couple of big ideas before we go. So the first thing is web components built into the web platform. You're not adding to Zuckerberg's framework. You're not adding to Google's framework, although maybe at like one time it was Google's framework. But now you're building into the web platform now that every browser supports it. And if we have good accessible custom elements, we have a pathway forward for more native elements because you've shown it worked. And it looks like HTML, and it is HTML. It's custom HTML, custom element, and maybe we can make it a native element through a process of vetting and research and stuff like tabs, accordion, a 3D model element, a pop-up element. Maybe this stuff could go through sort of a standardization process. And that's sort of what we're kind of doing in OpenUI, which is kind of just a research vehicle. It's a community group. We're like looking at all the design systems and finding all the commonalities and analyzing all the components and kind of writing up sort of like basically a research document about every component. And then sort of like, maybe this is our like recommendation or just like our hope that what can come out of this. This would be a cool to have and then we can propose that to a standards body and maybe one day get the tabs element because that would be wonderful. And again, the last thing I want to say is like an easier web. Why do I care about that? Is like an easier web lowers barriers. Less complexity, less tooling, less setup, less server costs or whatever, less gatekeeping truly makes a web for everyone. And that's where we want to go. We want to go to a web where anyone can create whatever they want, 2D or 3D. We want to make it a web for everyone, not just for like whatever super wizards with technology. So thank you for listening. If you have questions about web components, use web components, please let me up. Hit me up on Twitter, DavidTron5000. I'd love to hear how things are working out for you. And thank you for having me.